You're listening to Were You Still Talking? Hey, welcome back. This is Were You Still Talking? Today in my studio, or actually by Zoom, unfortunately, maybe for another year. I don't know, hopefully shorter than that. I have Simon Tam on today, and this is it's one of the first people that I've had in the last couple months that I don't need to look at an intro sheet for because I have known of Simon for a long time. I am friends of his on Facebook, although we've never met face-to-face or even Zoom-to-face. But a long, long time ago, I actually tried out or talked about auditioning for his band, which he doesn't know, so I'll talk about that later. So he's on here today because he is the creator of a band called the Slants. And he wrote a book, the book's called Slanted, and it's Asian American Troublemaker. It's about his, not only about the journey of the band, which is an amazing and entertaining journey. I'm listening to it on Audible, which Simon did himself, which is always nice when the author reads the book. It's an awesome thing, and also he knows a lot about recording, so he's able to do that. But it's about his battle to use Slanted as a trademark that went all the way to the Supreme Court. Absolutely phenomenal. How you doing, Simon?
I'm doing well. Thank you thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you. Really, it's my pleasure. I've been fascinated by this journey for a long time. I've actually been watching it. I had no idea of the details because, I see a couple of Facebook posts, but now listening to the book, it's phenomenal. I mean, it's really... and the book gets into so many different things. The hidden racism in America that none of us think about, being Asian American, being in a band, what it's like being on the road with a band, which I'm somewhat familiar with. It's a lot. There's a lot more adventures than I think people realize. They just see the band on stage, but they don't realize. They don't think about the broken down vans and all those kind of things. So I'm really enjoying the book. It's great.
I'm glad you're enjoying it. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, you bet. And again, I do like, it's always nice when an author narrates. Now, not every author can narrate their own book for different reasons, but it's great that it's you narrating it. It's really nice. And it's fun to have the different musical interludes and stuff like that. It's really well done. I'm assuming you did that all in your own studio.
I did.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying it. It was definitely something I had in mind because when I was thinking about having an audiobook, I too, as a fan of books, like read by their own authors, I just think there's just something unique, like an authentic voice, the personal connection that sometimes comes through in the reading that's hard to get from just another voice talent. And I also, just as a fan of music, thought, how cool would it be to like put in sounds from the band so that when I'm talking about a song that people can actually hear the song and make more of a direct connection to the material.
I think that works. It works really well. And, it's also really good marketing, to be honest with you. It's a great idea. So, wow, this, I don't know where to start here. Oh, I'll start from the beginning. Probably 10 years ago, since I think it was 10 years ago, it was 12, I answered an ad for a drummer for the Slants. That's how I first knew of you, how I got on your Facebook, as a Facebook person. It was years and years ago. Yeah, so and you answered back, and I think you were ready to audition me, except that when you said, "Do you mind if we jump around on your drum set?" That's when I kind of bowed out.
Okay. So
that's when I went, wait a minute, this, if you buy the drum set, sure.
If it was jumping on the drum set, then this would be pretty early on in our career. So
it had to have been.
I'm guessing somewhere between 07 and 09 when we were looking for drummers. And because that was part of our show, we just had this very chaotic live show. And the first drummer we had, we would, I would jump on his kick drum and while playing mid-song, and we'd kick over his cymbals, and he was fine with it. He would oftentimes get in on throwing around his drums. So I think that's probably why we were asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's a reasonable question. I'm glad you asked before. before someone's in the band and on the road, and you.
Sure.
I mean, it's good to ask.
Yeah,
rather
eventually
than
we
just
did have a drummer. Like our long-time drummer, Tyler, was like not having it. So, we ended up having a drummer for almost 9 years that didn't partake in that unless we were renting a kit and we cleared it with the rental company and everything first. But, we know that some people are much more particular about their gear, and we definitely wanted to respect that.
Yeah, it's been kind of a large expenditure for me over the years. So it would make. I guess if I got in a band like that, I would just buy a new kit that I didn't care about at all.
Yeah, you could. I had basses that I would buy, like really inexpensive bass guitars, especially the first 2 years of the band, and I would get them at pawn shops or eBay, and oftentimes they wouldn't really be working well. So I would get them, fix them up, get them to a state where it sounded decent enough, and then at the end of the show I would just smash it, or I would throw it across the stage or do something else with it. And for a while, because it was like $50 or $60 here and there, after it got to a point where I couldn't repair it anymore with soldering kits and tape, I would donate the broken bass to charity. Like we would play at events where there would be a charity fundraiser or something, where I would give it to someone. And after a while, I was like, this is getting kind of expensive. So I stopped doing that. Like about year 2 or 3, I decided I'm not going to do that anymore.
Right. It does. So, breaking equipment gets expensive, as the Who found out a long time ago.
Well, see, like Keith Moon actually lit a stick of dynamite in his drum set.
Yes, he did.
So I was like, that's the ultimate. Like if I could do that, I would love it. But
and his guitar player is still deaf from it. Yeah.
Yes, and it seems a little bit dangerous. So it's probably a good thing that I didn't end up having access to dynamite.
Right. Well, that was one of my favorite bands growing up. That's one of the people I learned to play drums from.
Sure.
Huge hero of Keith. I never understood how anyone could play that well and that out of control. Like it never seemed like he knew where he was going next, but it all worked.
I think
it's crazy.
That's the case with a lot of like my favorite musicians. They oftentimes are really chaotic, or they give the sense of chaos, but they're so well trained that they control it all. Like you don't have to worry about it. Like, or they make it seem very flawless and simple, as if this was nothing. And
right.
I think a lot of like punk musicians can be very good musicians, but they don't give that vibe at all. They make you think like they just picked it up and they're terrible. But the reality is there's a lot of really good players, and they just play so simply, or they just they don't try and embellish what they're doing with, in terms of like solos and that kind of thing. And they're just solid players. But the way they give it the impression is that they're just very simple, when in reality it's much more deep and nuanced than that.
Yeah, I think Nirvana is a really good example of that, because we're kind of anti polish. Their whole thing was not to be polished. But when I read the biography about them, they worked really, really hard to get there.
Absolutely.
They worked really hard on every song and getting everything exactly how they wanted it. And then when they played, though, they had it down, so they didn't have to think about it. So it looked like they're just, like it's nothing, which is interesting. It was an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's one of the fun things about music and kind of the theater of music, I think.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's an amazing thing about music, and also how much it can change things. Which is, one of the amazing things about your book is how much. It's like you started out on a musical journey, and then it went places that I think you didn't expect it to go. It starts with a question and answer session at a anime convention, I believe. You want to talk a little bit about that?
So we did. I forgot that was actually pretty early on. This is about 3 months into me actually launching the band. Like once we actually had our first show, I booked our band for a gig at an anime convention because I happened to come across one, and I thought, wow, there's like thousands of these geeky kids who are really, really into Asian culture. Well, I have like a, Asian American band that celebrates this culture. Why don't we actually play this and show them what a real rock band's like? And after playing a couple of them, we would notice that we would oftentimes be the only Asians in the entire event. Like it was kind of weird. And one of these moments that really jumped out at me was the first time we played in Nashville, Tennessee. And this was at an anime convention. We got asked to be a part of a panel, which was not uncommon. Like we would do autograph sessions and panels as just a great way to promote the show. And one of the guest liaisons asked us to be a part of this panel called Asians in America. So I was like, sure, why not? What's it about? And they're like, Asians in America. Like they rounded up all of the Asian guests and put them together in a room and let people ask questions. And it was the weirdest thing to me because like we walked into this room and it was jam-packed full of people, and many of them had actually never met an Asian American in person before. So they had all kinds of ideas, and the person introduced this panel saying like, well, welcome to Asians in America. This is a free form panel. Anything's on the table. Like if there's anything you've always wondered about and things that you always want to know about being Asian or Asian culture, you can ask these guests. And I was not expecting what was to come. I was just like, are you kidding me? And people would ask everything from like, the size of genitals and shape and direction of them to if we use chopsticks when we ate things like pizza and hamburgers, or if we actually could drive like we do in the Fast and the Furious. It was just mind-boggling and at first kind of upsetting because you're just like, this is like every ridiculous stereotype out there. Is this for real? But as we kind of went into it, probably 20, 30 minutes in, we just started having a lot of fun with it and just realized, you know what, this is our chance to actually address this stuff in a real and authentic kind of way. So it ended up being really, really positive. And we had a lot of great conversations with the attendees there about like why they even had these notions to begin with. Like what were the things that are being taught about us through society, through movies, books, TV shows, and that sort of thing. And it gave us a chance to actually correct it instead of just allowing these assumptions to stay.
That's the amazing thing. I mean, it kind of surprises me that in a city that big, there were so many people who are fans of anime, but never actually met an Asian person. I mean, I guess I'm really, I guess the opinions I get here are kind of slanted because, no pun intended, because I live on the West Coast. And even though I live in a very small town, there's still a lot of different cultures that come through here. And then I realized when I moved to Los Angeles for a while that there was only, there wasn't much culture here at all. But I still had, I had seen different cultures from all over the world growing up. But
Yeah,
so it's just amazing that people kind of believe stereotypes. Like I knew when watching old movies, when I saw, stupid caricatures of Asians, I just knew that wasn't real because I've met people before.
Sure.
So it's interesting.
And I actually ended up living in Nashville for a few years, and it's actually more diverse than people give it credit for. Like it was more diverse than Portland, Oregon, where I lived for a huge chunk of time. But I think what ends up happening is like just because they happen to be there or own restaurants or shops, it didn't necessarily mean that the people would interact with them. So they would only kind of interact with one small facet of who those people were, like going to the restaurant to eat, but not necessarily like knowing anybody in school. And so I think that just gave kind of like a very kind of shallow, one-dimensional look at like an entire body of people that happens to be very, very diverse. So I think that was part of it. And I think the other part is just sometimes you just get inundated with images like throughout your entire life. And whether you're conscious of it or not, you start believing in those images. So for example, the United States didn't actually have an on-screen kiss between an Asian male and a Caucasian female until the 2010s. Like the entire history of television, it was never on TV until The Walking Dead. And it was like really controversial at the
I
time.
didn't realize that.
But still,
wow.
And if you think about it, and nowadays, of course, we have Crazy Rich Asians and some other cinema, but back then, even in like early 2010, even up to like 2015, I would do these panels, and as I was, as I would be interacting with attendees, I would be like, can anyone name a major motion picture with an Asian male as the lead in a romantic comedy? And out of the how many hundreds of thousands of films out there, no one can name a single one. And I'm like, can you name any major character on like Asian male in that kind of role on a TV show that actually speaks English? That is, and no one could do it. Not until Fresh Off the Boat came out and Crazy Rich Asians and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a time period in the mid 2000s where the only Asian characters on primetime television that were on TV, the only two actors that were on TV, both spoke other languages other than English. So you didn't have a single character that was just an Asian American. And there's something about that if you're repeatedly told that, hey, these people are like not American, or we're not presented as American. Like it's a weird thing if we happen to be speaking without an accent or something like that. Like there's something that unconsciously we start building these images again and again.
That's even another reason to like The Walking Dead.
It's awesome.
I'm a huge fan of that show, but I never thought about
Glenn got killed.
Well, until Glenn, yeah, that was terrible.
It kind of went
downhill. That was terrible. Yeah, I have not finished it, but I left it for a long time, and then I went back to it and realized, oh, now they're doing even different, even weirder new things. That's really impressive. But the fact that Glenn was just a character. You don't really think of him as an Asian American. Like they played him as a person, which is rare, and it's the kind of thing that sometimes programs do. They probably were thinking about it, but I, as an audience member, I didn't think about it at all, and it's huge. It had an impact. It made a difference.
Same thing with the actors. They actually make a lot of acting choices based on that. And you can see interviews with Steve Nguyen, who plays Glenn on The Walking Dead. And he just was like saying how he didn't want to play up anything like he just wanted to be himself and bring himself to the show. He didn't want to be like, oh, came from some convoluted background about being like somehow finding his way from Korea to America or something like that. He was just like, I just wanted to be the guy who wore baseball caps, who was like, he was really handy. Like he could sneak in and out of situations like there's no tomorrow. And like he was, the thing I really like about the show and about his characters, he became kind of the moral compass of the show for a long time. His character was the one that kind of would bring people back to center, remind them of their humanity, which I think for me, that's why I said like until his character wasn't on the show anymore, like that was my favorite era, because after that it got dark.
Yeah.
I watch it and I feel really depressed about people.
But it changes. It comes and goes. And he's not the one wielding a katana either, which is
that's true. That's Michonne. Yeah.
That's Michonne. And he's also without that character, there would be no show. Yeah, because he saved everyone in the first shows. They pointed that out on one of the Talking Deads. I also watched The Talking Dead, and they pointed out how without Glenn, there's no Walking Dead. And I was like, oh, he was right. That's true. He saved everybody. He's the only one that,
and their spin-off shows too. So
that's right. Just starting those. Wow, that's nuts. Anyway, enough about that. Back to your book. So you grew up in San Diego. And then you moved to Portland. You moved to Portland to be in another band. Isn't that right?
Yeah. This was in 2003. I decided to drop out of college a couple months before graduating to move across the country to Portland so I could join this band called the Stivs. And the Stivs was very much like an old school punk band. we oftentimes were described as a cross between Iggy Pop and the Stooges and AC/DC. And I think that's where I really love that kind of sense of chaos on stage, because that band was like wild on stage and it was so much fun. But that was the band that I toured with for a bit before I ended up starting the Slants.
And when did you find out? I was surprised, not surprised by this. When did you find out that Portland was the whitest city in America?
Oh, that was probably I want to say about a year after living there.
Wow.
I mean, I had been walking the streets and that sort of thing. I'm like, this feels different than San Diego, but I couldn't quite place it. Like, I didn't really understand. I didn't think a whole lot about it. And then once it was pointed out, I was like, oh, that's what was missing, because
every other culture in America.
It was just weird. Like, I just,
yeah.
But you look at, in a lot of ways, Portland kind of reflected what was on TV, what was in the movies, and what was presented as far as like being featured by music magazines like Spin and Rolling Stone. So you just kind of, everything was like, it was very white, and white is kind of the default culture in our country. So you don't really think about it until it's pointed out. Then you're like, oh, wow, that is weird. I haven't seen a person of color in like 6 months. Like, that's a weird thing. They should be weird.
Really strange. Yeah. Because, that is a bizarre thing. Because
it really kind of like jumped out at me when I was actually looking for members of the band. When I wanted to start an Asian band, or a band that was primarily Asian, that celebrated this kind of shared heritage, I just would look for people in the street. And then I was like, wow, there's like nobody here. And so it got to a point where sometimes I'd go out to eat, and then I would find like a table of Asian people, and I'd go introduce myself. Like, excuse me, I don't see a lot of Asian people around here. I don't suppose one of you play music, because I'm trying to start this band. And half the time they would be from out of town just visiting. Like, they'd be coming from Eugene or something like that. And I'm like, okay, well, that, like, when you start thinking about things in terms of diversity and you start looking for things, that's when it becomes much more apparent.
Right. And I think that's also one of the reasons that maybe racism persists so much, because a lot of areas, especially in this country, they don't see any other culture. Correct. So, they might be accepting of something that they don't even see. It's like, why is this culture important? Yeah, it's not, it's not here.
Like, and if you don't think about it because you're not around it, or you don't really interact with people, then it's very hard to prioritize. I mean, like, Gallup did the study, and they said 3 out of 4 white Americans in America did not have a single Black friend or relationship of significance. Like, they might have an acquaintance or a random coworker, but not like a close friend, not like the person you dial up when you have to move your house or like get a ride to the airport. And that's shocking, but it's not that surprising. Like, and it, because we kind of like prioritize the issues that are close to home, that we're familiar with. It's, I think, a lot of the same reason why, same-sex marriage wasn't a big deal for most people. Like, most people didn't think about it. They just were completely fine with it being like illegal, until a lot of people started making noise, and until it appeared in pop culture through shows like Will and Grace, which I think removed a lot of the barriers. And then people started coming out, and we realized, wow, these are our family members, our friends, our neighbors. This is an issue that should matter. And then all of a sudden, within the span of just a few years, you saw this huge wave of change from the majority of people being opposed to the majority of Americans being pro same-sex marriage. And I think we haven't had that level of reckoning when it comes to race yet, because a lot of people still would like to believe that racism is this thing of the distant past, and something that we feel very uncomfortable with discussing.
Oh, right. I think that's true. I mean, in a way, what's happening right now is I don't want to say it's a good thing, but it's an eye opener. I've been seeing this for 30 years, more than that, really. Since, I was born in '63, which is when Kennedy was shot, which was the the height of the beginning of the civil rights movement, and the fact that it's still around 57 years later, and there are huge steps that have been taken since then. But it's just, for someone like myself, it's mind-boggling that it's still so prevalent, that people still see other people as different because their color of their skin is bizarre. And there's, everyone talks, there's so much different people putting solutions out there, but it's a very tough thing to find a solution for. It's like, what in the world, how do you get through to people? Education is a big factor, I guess. People who have education seem to be far less inclined to be ignorant about race. But it's a tough thing, because I don't know. It's like, where does it go from here? I'm worried now that what's happening literally in the streets could be hurting the case, because it gets so much bad press, whether the press is right or not, whether it's true or not. It's nuts.
I think, it's going to require change in a couple of different areas, because we know with racism, there are three primary areas where it kind of perpetuates. Most people think about individual racism, like why some people harbor ill feelings towards people of color, or why they hold these kind of stereotypes and that sort of thing. And that's just one part of it. The other is like, we also have a systemic or institutionalized problem. So laws that inadvertently discriminate against people based on race. But tied in with all of that is this cultural problem. And we have a culture that hasn't really had a genuine reckoning with race. And you mentioned like what's happening with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, with the numerous people kind of advancing this issue. It's becoming more and more prevalent to talk about in our culture, but we haven't had like a real reckoning. When you think about the history of like other major kind of race-related events, like Nazi Germany, like what did we do? What did the world do when we finally defeated Nazi Germany? We put people on trial. We made people apologize for what happened. They had to pay reparations. They had to like pass laws like, hey, Nazism is not acceptable. When apartheid fell in South Africa, it was the same kind of thing. They actually brought a council up of people of all the different tribes of the area and say, okay, how are we going to like create power structures that are actually equal? They acknowledged and apologized and wanted to find ways to amend the harm they did to the community. Well, nothing like that happened here. Not with the fall of slavery, not with the end of segregation. We're still finding that people are still passing legislation that kind of perpetuates discrimination or division. And so that's what I'm saying is like, we need to have that reckoning at that moment to say like, you know what, as a culture, as a society, we acknowledge what has happened. We apologize from it. And moving forward, we're going to have a shared sense of power to change not only our laws, but this culture that's upholding this idea that it's uncomfortable or unnatural to talk about race, when in fact, it should be very natural. It's a major part of our identities and communities, and it shifts American culture in a lot of important ways. So we just need to have those kinds of like conversations, whether folks want them or not.
Yeah, it's good that we're starting to. It's starting to be out there every day, but I see a serious problem from every. This is kind of shining a light on the fact that yes, the police force is a racist institution, and there's a lot more of them. I mean, government is a racist the federal government is a racist. I mean, there's all kinds of racism kind of built in to how they operate right now. There's also too much power given to too few people. So sure. it makes it really, really hard to fight and make changes against. And when things die down, I mean, I was in Los Angeles for the riots in Los Angeles. Okay, when they burned a good part of the city. I mean, I was literally a block away from getting my head bashed in, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It made no difference. I mean, they just waited for it to die down, and then they put blame on different people, and it didn't mean anything, all in all, And they also, I read an interesting article a month or two ago about how this will all be ghosted. They were actually talking about the virus, but I know it'll be worse with the racism. They will try to just not talk about it once it's kind of died down, which is also a big problem. Is that and why I'm really impressed with the people who are still in the streets and the people who have, are keeping this conversation going, even though I don't agree with everything they're doing. They're staying out there. They're saying, no, this is this isn't going away. There needs to be something done about it. What's hard is what to do about it, I guess. That's the tough thing.
It's the tough thing. And it's tough because a lot of people want very quick, decisive action. And I think that it's much more complex, much more nuanced than that. When it comes to shifting an entire culture, we got to look at that bigger picture. And sometimes that means the immediate solutions might not be that agreeable to folks, but we have to think about that long-term change. Like, what do we need to do in terms of like shifting our laws, policies, cultures, institutions? Like, it's easy to say, like, we need to stop the immediate harm, but it's much more difficult to to undo centuries of built systems. Like, I think about it, well, coming from the Pacific Northwest, I would battle these like stupid blackberry bushes. They grew like wildfire in my backyard.
Yep, very familiar.
You can cut them, you can burn them to the ground, you can spray Roundup. It doesn't matter, because if a single piece of it remains in the ground, it'll come back and destroy everything that you have. That's kind of like racism. Like, we not only do we need to trim it up and clean it up at the moment, we actually have to completely remove all of the pieces of it. But that's a much longer thing. So when it comes to dealing with the harms of our country, like we need to like have that solve. Like, okay, how do we deal with some of the immediate pains? But we got to go beyond that and say, how do we uproot the systems that uphold what is actually happening? And I think a lot of times people are just looking for the immediate thing. Like, how do I make my backyard look better immediately? And not knowing that, hey, in a year, it's going to pop up again. Like, so, like, this is why I think, like, in terms of like the protests and things that are happening, that is good for bringing immediate attention. But unless you actually address it by actually electing people and holding them accountable at the ballot box, everything from the president to the school board, not a lot's going to change. It's going to revert back, and people are going to forget that those major like things had actually took place or happened. Like you mentioned, like they would kind of ghosted, like people move on to the next big thing. But it's just like dealing with blackberries or any other kind of like reoccurring annoying like weed in your backyard. You have to maintain it. It requires like a constant vigilance, and that's how we see long-term sustaining change.
That's a really good point. Those are wise words, and that's unfortunately, like, I'm a person that thinks, well, you keep making laws about it. I don't know how much that helps, but it's what you have to do. I mean, some people still disagree with segregation laws. Some people still disagree with, that people should be able to go to whatever school they want to go to. And those laws were made 30 years ago. But in reality, this is not a couple hundred years old. This is 10,000 years old.
Sure.
This is, as long as there have been people on the planet, they've looked at other tribes. Well, once there was 100 or so, they've looked at other tribes and said, that's not us. And then at a certain point, when there got to be thousands of people, the tribes would capitalize on that. The leaders would capitalize on that to control their tribe. They're not us. We're us. And it actually is one of the ways that people survive so long. In the book *Sapiens*, they kind of discuss that, is that, battling different tribes is a way that humans probably survived instead of Neanderthals. I mean, it's something really built into us. So it's really hard to say, we don't need this anymore. You know, we didn't need it 400 years ago. We don't need it. We certainly don't need it now. And it's especially hard that, well, it's really only 50 years that we've even been trying very hard in America.
Correct.
You know, 50 years ago, most of America was like, screw those guys.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. So it's
that's why I'm saying
you're right. You have to
change the culture too, because
right.
we have to change how people look at and define what do we mean by us or our tribe. But that, you know, in addition to that, we need to have laws that reflect it. And, you know, this is like, for me, like why I inadvertently, I think kind of unintentionally through my life story, became a free speech advocate, like an advocate for civil liberties, because it's well and good to like say we should ban hate speech. And like, of course, I don't think like people should be using hateful terms, but when we start really thinking about who gets to define what hate speech means and who gets to enforce and control that kind of thing, we start realizing we have to look at that bigger picture and say, wait, unless you protect the speech and views of people you disagree with the most, your own views and your own speech are going to be in danger. And so that's why like we have to think about what are the rules that are the most fair, like that we could all agree on, that would be the most fair no matter who was in charge. Like that's a big long-term thinking kind of thing that is very hard for people with who are experiencing immediate pain to really think about. And, you know, that's one of those things that I've just really been kind of grappling with lately is like, okay, how do we create change and how do we convince people that this law might not seem that great to you right now, but in the long term, you're really going to appreciate this thing.
That is what's really hard, because it's sort of like this law is going to affect your kids and they're going to really appreciate it. And free speech is I have a real struggle with that, a real struggle. I mean, after Nazis were defeated, Nazism was outlawed. You know, I think it's loosened up slightly, but you could not have Nazi symbols there. Correct. Period. Even though those symbols were stolen by Nazis and they were something they used, they didn't really, they got rid of them. So it's a tough one for me because but I'm on the same, I definitely agree that, who decides what hate speech is? Who decides what YouTube channel is supposed to be taken off because they said something that all the PC people didn't like. And, I'm a very far left-leaning person, but I think that the politically correct movement is killing a lot of the left side of the argument. Like it goes too far.
Well, I think
so. It's hard because it can definitely be seen as crushing free speech, as not allowing it, and that doesn't work either.
And that's the funny thing. Free speech used to be an issue championed by the left. Like that was
right.
The key value sets, especially when you think about like the civil rights movement, like the right to protest was like huge. But sometime in the last 10, 15 years, it became championed by the right, who decided that they felt victimized by what you mentioned there, the PC culture. And so now it's like kind of an odd situation where you still have some celebrated long-term institutions like the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, still fighting for it. But a lot of times people have very mixed feelings about it. Like support for freedom of speech by the left is kind of at an all-time low. So it's, and it's very much because of this feeling of uneasiness. Like, well, we don't want the other side to win. We don't want them to take advantage of this, like a loophole, even though it's been protecting our own people. And
the reality of it is that free speech can be taken to extremes when it's not free speech. It's people lying about things and getting away with it, basically, or putting out information that's false in order to make their opinion heard. That
absolutely,
it can be taken way too far, as we're seeing in this country now. I mean, we're seeing something that we haven't seen for a long time. Not that every politician hasn't lied. I mean, I know they have because,
Yeah.
there are aliens. Don't tell me. And
Well, I think,
so,
and what people forget is like those kinds of things are not protected. Like threats of violence. If you threaten someone, or if you're making a misleading statement, those things aren't protected by freedom of speech. And so I think what we find is it's not just because of like this uneasiness, because we're afraid like someone else will win. A lot of that uneasiness stems from the fact that most Americans don't understand their own inherent rights. They don't understand the Bill of Rights and how it actually impacts our day-to-day living and what is protected and what isn't protected. We know for a fact that the people organizing in the streets right now, protesting against this administration, that is 100% protected under the First Amendment.
right.
So the fact that the government is sending federal agents to stomp them down, to using unmarked vans, kidnapping people, and persecuting them, that is illegal. That's unconstitutional. But this is why we have to go back to like protecting our civil liberties and say like, hold on a second, like none of this matters if we don't have these basic inherited rights like protected, and that rights that were really hard fought for. We need to remember like they don't mean anything if people don't step up and actually enforce them.
True. That's very true. And when you have the cultures and so divided like they are now, it's really tough because one side wants to keep the propaganda going because that's how they're winning, and the other side wants to squash the propaganda even if it's not propaganda, like no matter what it is. Okay, somebody might be saying something that's true, but it's based on maybe that propaganda, so they can't say that either. And there's it's really nuts right now. But I also I know we don't have all day, and so I want to get into the a part of free speech that you dealt with directly, and a part of the, I would call, PC. It seems like you got hit by the PC wagon a little bit.
In some strange ways.
In some strange ways. But when I was listening to the book, I was like, well, this is a long time ago, and it was happening then. You were trying to trademark a name, and the trademark office decided that you couldn't do it for some insane reasons. Shorts, what happened there?
Well, in short, the trademark office had this old law that says you can't register trademarks that are considered scandalous, immoral, or disparaging, or in other words, like deeply offensive. And they said the name of my band, the Slants, was disparaging to persons of Asian descent, even though we were an Asian American band and we were playing Asian American festivals and doing outreach on behalf of the US government on Asian American issues. So that's kind of what happened. And that kicked off a battle that lasted almost a decade. And the funny thing about it is like, if in order for them to enforce this law, they were supposed to find, what's called a substantial composite, like a whole lot of Asian people had to be offended for them to be able to enforce the law. The problem is they didn't find a single person. They relied on internet sources like urbandictionary.com to justify their decision. And that's kind of like what put me on the path of being a free speech advocate, because I realized, I was like, hey, the intention of like not offending people, that's a good thing. But in this case, clearly no one was offended. Like the only people that were offended were non-Asian people being offended on our behalf. And that was just a mind-boggling thing, because we came back with surveys, community leaders. We had incarceration camp survivors write them letters. And despite the fact that it overwhelmingly demonstrated that Asian Americans were in support of the work we were doing, the government was like, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. And they just kept doubling down on that. And so that's what eventually took me to the US Supreme Court.
And this is what amazes me, is that you gave them, boatloads of sufficient evidence to reverse the decision, and basically they wouldn't do it. And it took you 8 years to get it done. I don't want to, spoil the book, for those who might go out and buy it. So I won't say what happened with the Supreme Court, but you had to take it all the way to the top. I don't know. It's just mind-boggling. And if you're playing punk music and you're not offending people, what are you doing?
Well, to be fair, the Slants was not. I never considered that a punk band. We always called ourselves synth pop, but that's the thing. I was like, art should be unconventional. It should shake people up a little bit. Like that's one of the main purposes of art, is to get people to think about society. And whether it's through our music or through our name or our stage show, like that's what we were doing. And, we should be a country that protects artistic expression in that particular way. And so it was just kind of really strange to find that America, so-called land of the free, was not like even recognizing that even with the arts, like, so we had the trademark office protecting institutions like the KKK and Stormfront and other major white supremacist hate groups through the trademark system. Yet when it came to an anti-racist band, they decided that was too edgy for them. It's very strange.
It's really bizarre. And I never even thought of the name as all. I mean, when I first saw it, I thought it was clever and it made sense for the band. And I never even considered that it might be offensive to somebody. And the other thing that blew my mind is all the other names that you have examples of in the book that they let go, that they said were okay. That just was like shocking to me. I don't know. I almost wonder if it was a bunch of white guys with the name, if that would have been okay.
Well, we were told that it would have been fine.
Oh, that's like, nuts.
We asked them, we said, like, hey, how come you allowed this? If this term is really as offensive as you say it is, how come you gave it to everyone else? Because there were almost 800 trademark registrations for slant or some variation of the word. And we said, what is it about this band that's different than all the hundreds of other people that you gave this trademark to? And they said, it's because you are too Asian. And they said, it's incontestable that the applicant is of Asian descent, so that was me, and part of an Asian band. So they said, so there's an association with this outdated racial slur. They said if it was an all-white band, we wouldn't associate the term with Asian people. But because the band is comprised of Asian people, you can't distance yourself away from the term or not. So in other words, in the name of fighting against racism, they were denying me rights based on my race. And that's just one of the weird upside down ways that our laws get enforced when we start thinking like, hey, we can appeal to someone and give them our rights, like our dignity, and say like, you should know better, and you can decide what is offensive or not offensive. And this is one of the kind of the weird things about the freedom of speech battle. We find that the people in charge oftentimes can't make logical decisions that involve people with experiences that they don't share. So in the 8 years that I went through this legal battle, they did not speak to a single Asian about the issue. They thought they did not need to. Because they already consulted urbandictionary.com.
Well, this is what blows my mind, is they were basing their decision from the get-go, and then they defended it on urbandictionary.com, basically on a Google search. So rather than do any real research, they did a Google search and they went, we're good.
Yeah. Well, that's the nature of power. I mean, you think about it, we get involved with debates with people we disagree on. And if they say something that contradicts us, even if they're if they're right and we're wrong, it usually takes a lot for most people to say, you know what, I was wrong on that. More often than not, people tend to pivot. They say like, oh, no, that's, you're misinterpreting me. And we kind of double down on our position. Well, the government takes that and they magnify that by like 1,000-fold. And they're like, no, there's no way we could be wrong about this. And they will go to the very top of the chain to the Supreme Court in order to defend that position, no matter what it might be. My obscure trademark law cases, yes, that's part of it. But we have the same government who fought like the ability to integrate our schools, who fought, so that our government to this day still has never apologized for locking up American citizens of Japanese descent, stuck them in concentration camps. We said that was our right to do so. Like, we never said that was a bad decision. And it's kind of interesting to see, like, this is that same problem, that the problem of division is oftentimes driven by ego and pride. And our government is a prime example of what happens when we, don't afford someone else the dignity to say we are wrong about something.
That's really true. That makes a lot of sense. And I think that's what a lot of the tearing down statues has to do with it. I mean, I appreciate that these statues were a work of art that someone did, but they don't need to be standing anywhere in a park or in front of a Capitol building. They can be somewhere else. But I understand the other side for that very reason, is that they've seen this statue there for literally 200 years and nobody had a problem with it. So why are they having a problem with it now? The reality is that they did have a problem with it for 200 years. It's just, they're seeing this chance. Yeah, they didn't have a voice. Exactly. They didn't have a voice. So it's a really good point. And getting people to pivot, I know from myself, is very difficult. It's hard to get people to see a different point of view, especially when in this kind of media culture, when everyone is screaming everything, points of views aren't really discussed very much. Well, that's why I like podcasts, because I can have someone on and discuss something with them for a bit instead of just, this is probably the most I've talked politics on my podcast, because there's just so many political podcasts out there. And, but because I knew this story, I really wanted to have you on and talk about it. And it's a phenomenal book. It's quite a story, and it's a head scratcher. Like, it's just, I mean, it's really amazing what it goes through. And also, I mean, it's great that you weave in not only what a band goes through, but what you started the band and you became kind of the band manager. And you wore, and the producer, and you wore a lot of hats. So I think that's an interesting story too. Is that there's so much more to getting a band on stage and in the studio and on a recording than people have any idea. So I like that you're telling that story at the same time. And really, you start with that story, and then you kind of ease into this insane trademark thing.
Well, a lot of it came from reading Anthony Bourdain's book, Kitchen Confidential. I just love that inside story about his pathway to becoming a chef and what it was like working in the kitchens, and especially after hours. And it just reminded me so much of being a touring musician. And that's why I was like, oh, I want to give people a little bit of a glimpse of this, because I spent a lot of my time, I did until this year, I spent it touring the country and speaking at law firms and law schools and the American Bar Association and groups like that. And I would always try and tell them like kind of the behind the scenes story to my law case, but I wanted them to know what it was like beyond like being the face of the Supreme Court case. Like, I'm like, there's so much more to it, because like I still had a life outside of this case, and I was a struggling musician. I was trying to deal with all these other things that weren't really easy to deal with, that most people don't even think about, that like a musician would have to deal with. And so I wanted to bring it to life, to say like, paint the whole picture of like, here's what it was like emotionally, mentally, to go through this entire journey. And it's a weird head trip. Like, I mean, I still think about it from time to time. Like, I can't believe this happened.
I can imagine that you would think that. Whoops, somebody's calling me. That's so weird. I just started my iPad to look at something and someone called me. How dare they?
What timing?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. What is the status of the Slants now? Is there
So
still a Slants or
kind of.
kind of?
So yeah, we're no longer touring as a band, not just
Mhm.
because of COVID. We actually made this decision like last November. We wanted to focus primarily on our nonprofit. So we started a nonprofit organization called the Slants Foundation, where we raise money to provide funding and mentorship to aspiring artists who want to incorporate a little activism into their life. So that's kind of been the main focus. We're still writing and we're working on another album, but that album's not just going to incorporate our band members now. We're actually going to be collaborating with artists from around the country so that we can use our platform to highlight their work and create something together. So I'm really, really excited about that.
Yeah, that is awesome. That's really awesome. It's good work, and you've been doing good work for years. It sounds like kind of unintentionally, but it's great that you took that on and that you're doing it. We are gonna wrap it up here. I know you've got other things you got to do, but really, really appreciate having you on the podcast. This has been very informative, really good. It was great
Thank
talking to
you.
you.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thank you for listening to the book. So for folks who are interested in it, they can just go to slantedbook.com. You can read a sample online, or I think Audible is the carrier of the audiobook. So I think people can like get a link to it from the website too.
Yeah, Audible. That's how I'm listening to it, and I'm really glad that I could listen to it without a subscription.
Oh, great.
Maybe I need a
Yeah.
prescription, but that's a different story.
Yeah.
So this is Joel Albrecht, and you've been listening to Were You Still Talking? My guest today has been Simon Tam, from formerly of the Slants, but also of a lot of other things. A lot going on. His book Slanted, an Asian American troublemaker, story of an Asian American troublemaker, is available now. It's just an amazing book. You really should check it out. And I will be back very soon with more amazing guests. So thank you for listening, and as always, be good to each other. And as I've been saying lately, be good to yourself. Take lots of vitamin E. And there we go. That's it.
All right.
Gonna
I'm just
end my
gonna-
recording. Oh no, that doesn't work. Okay.